What would you say if a crowd wanted you silenced, but you were given 1 moment to speak? What if the people shouting against you had already made up their minds? Would you still try to tell your story? And can one personal testimony break through anger, confusion, and noise? Paul had just been pulled out of chaos. Moments earlier, he was surrounded by a furious crowd in Jerusalem, accused, beaten, nearly killed. The noise was overwhelming, voices shouting from every direction. No one asking questions, no one waiting for answers. And now, as Roman soldiers carried him up the steps toward the barracks, it seemed like the moment had passed. But then something unexpected happened. Paul spoke to the commander, not in panic, not in anger, but calmly. "May I say something to you?" The commander was surprised. He had assumed Paul was someone else, an agitator, a rebel. But now, hearing him speak clearly, intelligently, he realized there was more to this man than the chaos suggested. "Do you know Greek?" he asked. Paul answered, explaining who he was, a Jew born in Tarsus, a citizen of no ordinary city, not a troublemaker, not a criminal, a man with a story. And then Paul made a request that must have seemed almost impossible in that moment. "Please let me speak to the people." Think about that. He had just been attacked by the same crowd. They had shouted against him, dragged him, beaten him, and now he wanted to speak to them. Why? Because his goal was never to win an argument. It was to share truth. The commander allowed it, and so Paul stood there on the steps between the soldiers and the crowd, a bridge between chaos and calm. He raised his hand and slowly, the noise faded. That alone is powerful, because sometimes even in the middle of anger, people will listen, if something about the moment shifts. And Paul began to speak, not in Greek, but in Hebrew, the language of the people, their language. And when they heard it, the crowd became even quieter. Because now this wasn't just a man speaking, this was someone who understood them, someone who was one of them. "Brothers and fathers," he said, "not enemies, not accusers, brothers, fathers." He didn't begin with defense, he began with connection, and then he told his story. "I am a Jew, born in Tarsus, but brought up in this city." He wasn't an outsider, he wasn't rejecting their identity. He shared it. He had studied under Gamaliel, one of the most respected teachers. He had been trained in the law. He had been just as passionate, just as committed as anyone in that crowd. In fact, he went even further. "I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today." That line matters, because it shows he understood their passion, their intensity, their desire to protect what they believed. He didn't dismiss it, he acknowledged it. And then he revealed something deeper. "I persecuted the followers of this way to their death." Now the crowd had to listen, because this wasn't a man standing against them. This was a man who had once stood with them. He had hunted believers, arrested them, approved of violence against them. He wasn't telling a distant story. He was telling their story. But then everything changed. Paul began to describe a moment that shifted his entire life. "As I was on the road to Damascus," you can almost feel the tension. The crowd listening, unsure of where this is going. About noon, a bright light from heaven suddenly flashed around me. This wasn't subtle. This wasn't something he could ignore. I fell to the ground and heard a voice say to me, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" In that moment, everything he believed, everything he thought he understood was challenged. "Who are you, Lord?" he asked. And the answer changed everything. "I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting." Jesus. The very name that divided them. The very name that had stirred so much tension, the very name at the center of everything. Paul wasn't speaking theory, he was speaking encounter, something real, something personal, something that forced him to rethink everything. He explained how those with him saw the light, but didn't understand the voice, how he was blinded, how he had to be led by the hand into Damascus, from strength to dependence, from certainty to confusion. And then came another moment. A man named Ananias, a devout observer of the law, respected by the Jews, not someone they could easily dismiss. Ananias came to Paul and said, "Brother Saul, receive your sight." And in that moment, Paul could see again. But more than that, he could understand. Ananias told him that God had chosen him, that he would know his will, that he would see the righteous one, that he would hear his voice, and that he would be a witness to everyone about what he had seen and heard. This wasn't Paul choosing a new path randomly. This was a calling, a purpose given, a direction set, And then came the turning point. "What are you waiting for?" Ananias said, "Get up, be baptized, and wash your sins away, calling on his name." This was the moment, the decision, the shift from who he was to who he would become. And Paul shared it openly, not hiding his past, not minimizing his change, but owning it fully, completely. And then, he continued, he spoke of returning to Jerusalem, of praying in the temple, and of falling into a trance. In that moment, he saw the Lord speaking to him again. "Leave Jerusalem immediately," the Lord said, "because the people here will not accept your testimony about me." Paul didn't expect that. In his mind, his story should have convinced them. "They know my past," he argued. "They know what I used to do." But the answer was clear. "Go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles." And this is where everything shifted. Up until this point, the crowd had been listening, quiet, focused, engaged. But when Paul said Gentiles, everything changed. Because that word challenged something deep. It challenged identity. It challenged tradition. It challenged boundaries they had held tightly. And suddenly the silence broke. The crowd erupted again, shouting, rejecting, refusing. "Rid the earth of him," they cried. "He's not fit to live." The same pattern returned. Noise, anger, rejection. But now something was different. Because Paul had spoken. He had told his story. He had shared truth. And whether they accepted it or not, it had been heard. This moment revealed something powerful. You cannot control how people respond to your story, but you can choose to tell it. Paul didn't speak to win approval. He spoke to share truth. And sometimes truth divides before it transforms. Because people hear it through their own fears, their own beliefs, their own expectations, and not everyone is ready to receive it. But that doesn't make it less true. It just means the work is still unfolding. Paul's courage in that moment is not just about standing in front of a crowd. It's about vulnerability, honesty, clarity. He didn't hide who he used to be. He didn't pretend his journey was simple. He showed the process, the struggle, the transformation. And that's what makes a story powerful. Not perfection, but change. So what does this mean for us? It means your story matters. Not because it's perfect, but because it's real. It means your past does not disqualify you. It becomes part of your message. It means that even when people misunderstand you, even when they reject what you say, even when they don't respond the way you hoped, there is still value in speaking truth. Because you never know who is listening. You never know whose perspective might shift. You never know what seeds are being planted in that moment. Paul spoke to a crowd that rejected him, and yet his words continue to impact people today. That's the power of truth. It doesn't depend on immediate acceptance. It endures. It spreads. It reaches beyond the moment. So if you've ever felt hesitant to share your story, if you've ever thought, what's the point? If you've ever been afraid of how people might respond, remember this moment, standing on those steps. Facing that crowd, Paul chose to speak. And that choice made a difference. Not because everyone agreed, but because truth was spoken. And truth always has a way of moving forward, even through resistance, even through rejection, even through noise. So the question is, what is your story? What has changed in your life? And are you willing to share it? Not perfectly, not forcefully, but honestly. Because someone, somewhere, may need to hear exactly what you've experienced. And your voice might be the one that reaches them. Thank you for watching this video. If this message spoke to you, don't forget to like, follow the channel, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this today.